So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Danielle Daw. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the Halton Hills Public Library, and I will be your host for this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all joining tonight's call from communities across Ontario, and we recognize that we are residing in different treaty territories. So I am joining from the Halton Hills Public Library, which is located on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit on Treaty 19. Now, Treaty 19 was agreed upon by the Mississaugas of the Credit and the British Crown in 1818. And we recognize this land as being the home and traditional territory to other Indigenous people since time immemorial. Now, tonight's lecture is offered in partnership with Credit Valley Conservation and the town of Halton Hills. I also want to thank the Friends of the Halton Hills Public Library and CFEW Georgetown for their ongoing support of the Halton Hills Lecture Series. So we have two housekeeping items before we get started. The Q&A for tonight's lecture is going to be taking place through the chat box. We just ask when you submit your question, if you can make sure it's directed towards everyone so that all of us on the call are able to see the questions that are coming in. If you do have any technical difficulties during the presentation tonight, one of our library associates, Natalie, is on the call. So you can reach out to her through the chat box as well if you need any assistance. And then finally, just note that tonight's presentation is being recorded and we will make it available on the library's YouTube channel. So as you may know, the town of Halton Hills declared a climate emergency in May of 2019 and set a goal to become a net zero community by 2030. To address climate change in our community, the town is taking adaptation and mitigation actions, which includes using natural assets such as trees. So during this lecture, you'll learn more about tree health and ongoing issues that are affecting Halton Hills and the surrounding area. Tonight, we are joined by Bryana McLaughlin, Coordinator of Terrestrial Restoration and Management with Credit Valley Conservation. So in this role, Bryana is responsible for coordinating integrated pest management of invasive species on CVC lands, including early detection monitoring, management, and providing technical knowledge to watershed partners and the public. Bryana earned her Bachelor of Science and Master's of Science in Biology from the University of Western Ontario, where she studied the effects of future climate scenarios on early successional tree and shrub species. We are pleased to have her join us tonight to talk about the LDD moth and other invasive insects that are affecting our region. So without further ado, here is Bryana.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me out tonight. I'm going to share my screen and get started here. Okay, so just confirm everybody can see that. Okay, I didn't hear no, so I'm going to go for it. Okay, so thank you very much for having me out tonight. I'm very excited to be here and excited to talk to you all about some invasive insects and tree health. So looking at ongoing issues as well as emerging threats. So what I wanted to talk to you about tonight was give you a quick overview of the Credit Valley watershed, as well as some programs that we have going on that might affect you in the Georgetown, Hungry Hollow area. And then get right into talking about Lymantria dispar, which is also known as LDD or Gypsy Moth. So we wanted to go over the history, identification and life cycle, impacts of that, outlook for 2022, as well as what CVC and landowners can do to combat this. Also wanted to touch on some new and emerging threats, so Hemlock woolly Adelgid, or HWA, as well as Asian Longhorn Beetle. So what the life cycle is, how to identify them, what impacts they might have on the ecosystem and around your neighborhood, as well as what to do if you spot them while you're out and about. So the Credit Valley watershed. So Credit Valley Conservation, or CVC, is a watershed-based organization. So all the area you can see in green here, from Orangeville all the way down to Lake Ontario, is the Credit River watershed. So all the water that falls within that green area either soaks into the ground or makes its way down the Credit River to Lake Ontario, or one of the smaller urban creeks that drain directly into the lake. So CVC is one of 36 conservation authorities in Ontario, and since 1954, CVC has been responsible for protecting, restoring, and managing natural resources within the watershed. So for those of you that are part of the Hungry Hollow Snap neighborhood, you may be familiar with some of the existing programs that CVC has in terms of restoring communities and enhancing natural assets within urban neighborhoods. And one of those things that programs within CVC are doing is the Hungry Hollow Snap. So that stands for Sustainable Neighborhood Action Program. And for those of you that live in the Hungry Hollow Snap neighborhood, CVC is doing a tree and shrub giveaway. So the giveaways available to any residents living within the neighborhood of Hungry Hollow Snap. We plan to do the tree and shrub giveaway to get plants to homeowners this spring, as long as there's no changes or restrictions to COVID. If you're part of this neighborhood and you're involved in the Hungry Hollow Snap, you can make your selection of trees and shrubs, and CVC can get those ready and have those delivered to you this spring. So as part of this program, you can choose one free plant per household, and you have a one-time opportunity to purchase more plants that can be delivered at the same time. So I have a selection of trees and shrubs available. There's red oaks, Freeman maples, white spruce, smooth serviceberry, alternate leaf dogwood, and ironwood, as well as 3 shrubs, including purple flowering raspberry, white meadowsweet, and northern bush honeysuckle. And if you are interested in doing this program and are within the area, you can visit our website, the Hungry Hollow Snap, cvc.ca neighborhood tree giveaway, and there's lots of information about these species to help you make the selection that's the right fit for your yard. Okay, so moving on to LDD in the watershed. So, okay, our first order of business is LDD has a new name again. So Gypsy Moth was the original common name of this species until 2021, when it was removed from the species list by the Entomological Society of America due to racial connotations from the name Gypsy and for the Roma people. So they removed it from the list as part of their Better Common Names project. And many organizations, including CVC, took up the use of the Latin name Lymantria dispar, or LDD for short, for ease of use in the meantime, while they were considering a new common name and doing the voting and other things that they do throughout this process. In March of this year, it was announced that the new common name of the species would be spongy moth. However, CVC will continue to use both LDD and spongy moth interchangeably until the new name catches on and becomes a little bit more widespread. So what is LDD? So LDD, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a non-native invasive moth that originated from Europe. It can use over 400 species as a host, but very much prefers oak, maple, and poplar trees. It also will use during outbreak years a variety of hosts, including willow, elm, birch, spruce, and many more. Each individual larvae or caterpillar can eat up to 1 meter squared of foliage, which is quite a lot. They have a lot of impacts. They can also have nuisance effects. So people can get a skin rash from the little hairs on the caterpillars. The caterpillar poop or frass can cause a lot of disgust and inconvenience, especially for people who have decks and pools and other outside infrastructure, as well as it can impact recreation. So to help you identify LDD moth, I'd like to take you through its life stages. So starting over on the left-hand side, the female lays egg masses in late summer, so end of July to mid-August, which overwinter on until the spring. So the egg masses are laid on tree trunks, bark, outdoor furniture, the sides of buildings, wood piles, and basically any hard sheltered surface. The egg masses are golden brown and fuzzy when they're fresh, and they have small hard eggs inside. They range up from a dime to toonie size and can contain up to 1,000 eggs each. So the caterpillars, which is the next step here, emerge from late April to mid-May, depending on spring conditions. So we should start to see them hatching in the next couple weeks or so. Tiny newly hatched caterpillars appear black and can be carried on the wind up to 1 kilometer from their hatch site. As they grow, their distinctive striping and spots that you can see in the circled diagram there start to appear. And during the early growth stages, caterpillars feed during the day, but as they get larger and easier for predators to spot, they begin to feed mostly at night. When the caterpillars are fully grown, they can be about 5 centimeters long. So you can see how that would make them conspicuous to birds and other things that might try to eat them. Caterpillar stage is the most destructive phase of the life cycle, as they eat the leaves from the time they emerge from their eggs up until they pupate in late July. The pupa, which is the next step in this diagram, stage 3, are dark brown in color with yellow-white hairs and can be found in sheltered spaces, so commonly in tree bark crevices, clumped leaves, or even shed or house overhangs. When the moths emerge, female moths are flightless and are white or cream in color. The males are brown or tan colored with frilly antennae to help them find that lucky lady in their life. They can fly long distances to mate, which contributes to their spread. Adult moths live for about 2 weeks after emerging, during which their sole purpose is to mate and lay eggs for the next generation. So how did LDD get here? LDD was actually brought to America and released by Leopold Trouvelot, who was an amateur entomologist, in 1869. He was attempting to crossbreed this LDD moth with a native silk moth to start a silk industry in the United States. And these moths escaped from his custody after his silk trade experiment was a failure, and they started escaping throughout the natural areas. These moths were first seen in Ontario in 1969 and started causing significant defoliation in 1981. So here we have a graph of moderate to severe defoliation events caused by LDD since the 1980s. So this map was done by the government of Ontario, the Ministry of Natural Resources, who monitors the LDD sort of on a provincial level. And you'll see that there's outbreak events leading to more severe defoliation every 5 to 10 years. And those events on average last about 3 to 4 years. So our current peak, the 20 to 21, is much higher than previous years. The reason for that is sort of yet to be determined. Scientists are still trying to figure out why this is higher and more intensive than in previous years. But we will talk a little bit about what causes an outbreak cycle and why they can be so challenging to predict. So outbreaks can be caused by a variety of things. So the presence of abundant hosts, if there's a lot of LDD moth's favorite tree species, that can increase their populations. They have lots of delicious things to eat and they are very healthy and get going. Also hot, dry springs and summers benefit LDD. It helps with caterpillar growth and development and minimizes disease. Warm winters with deep snow are also beneficial because they blanket the egg masses and help keep them safe from cold winter temperatures, which allows the LDD eggs to have better hatch rates in the spring. The insect's adaptability for movement is also helpful because the caterpillars can blow long distances on the wind. This allows them to settle in new areas and colonize new hosts. Also, periods of low abundance can lead to LDD spikes. If there's been a prolonged period with really low populations, that means that their natural enemies, the predators, parasites, and disease that feed on them also have low population numbers. And so when that's been going on for a long time, the LDD population suddenly hits a bump and there's not as many natural parasites, diseases, or predators going after them right away. Those populations take a little bit longer to follow the curve, and so they experience a bit of a spike. So what stops an outbreak? Oops, excuse me, sorry. Okay, so different things that can stop an outbreak is first is the nucleopolyhedrovirus, or NPV for short. And this is a virus that attacks only LDD caterpillars. It's spread from caterpillar to caterpillar through contact or close proximity because LDD caterpillars don't know how to social distance. When they are together in close proximity, you can get a wide spread of the virus. You may have seen caterpillars affected by the virus in your neighborhood. They tend to die upside down in a very characteristic V shape on the ends of branches. They're very fragile and kind of like crusty when they die, and they usually end up hanging off of trees or over branches in that V shape. Another cause of outbreak stop collapse is the fungus Entomophaga mimega, and that affects caterpillars by contact. It's a fungus that occurs in the soil, and when we have cool, wet springs, it can lead to a decline in the population because it gets spread again from caterpillar to caterpillar. Other things that can stop an outbreak are natural predators. So birds like blue jays, the robins you can see in this picture here, feeding an LDD caterpillar to their young. Orioles, nuthatches, chickadees, and other birds will eat LDD egg masses and caterpillars, as well as mice, shrews, voles, skunks, raccoons, and other small mammals will also make use of LDD. There's also parasitic insects that use LDD egg masses and caterpillars to lay their eggs and go through their life cycle. as well as things like starvation and outbreak years. Those caterpillars, because they eat so many leaves, can actually eat themselves out of house and home and cause population collapse due to lack of food within the immediate vicinity. Although they can move long distances when they're young, once the caterpillars are starting to develop and get larger, they really don't go very far from their host tree. So they can actually eat themselves right out of food. And also sustained cold winter temperatures with little snow can also decrease LDD populations because it prevents egg mass hatch. So the cold winter temperatures can kill the eggs within their egg masses, and then you don't get emergence in the spring. Okay, so this map here shows recent expansion in Southern Ontario of LDD. So this is based on mapping done by the Ministry of Natural Resources. So this map shows 2019, and this is looking at defoliation caused by LDD in 2019. So the orange and red areas you can see on the map are areas of moderate in the orange and severe in the red defoliation caused by LDD. And the ministry obtains this information by doing flyovers over these regions. So in 2019, they estimated that about 43,000 hectares of treed area was defoliated due to LDD. In 2020, that area increased to about 569,000 hectares. And you can see that not only is that spread through Southern Ontario, Southwestern Ontario, but also up near Kingston area, as well as a little bit north of Sudbury. And then in 2021, which was the largest outbreak year that we've had in history, was up to about 1.8 million hectares defoliated. And you can see, especially some of those more northern areas were extremely hard hit, the areas that hadn't been dealing with outbreak over the past 3 years. So you'll notice too that some of the more populated areas, so like the GTA, Toronto, Mississauga, as well as Guelph, aren't really showing up as red in here, despite there being a lot of caterpillars in the area and a large presence of LDD moth over the past couple of years. But unfortunately, the Ministry of Natural Resources doesn't do flyovers in populated areas. So this information is just for sort of more rural areas. So the $1 million question is, what is in store for 2022? And the answer is, it's kind of a long story, so bear with me. So in order to determine population levels for the next year, ag masses are counted within a specific area, and that data is extrapolated out to a forest stand or regional level. So these surveys are called modified Calidar plots, or MKP. And the Ministry of Natural Resources uses this in their forest areas to determine those maps that we saw previously. And MKP basically involves setting up a 10 meter by 10 meter plot. And then you survey for all the egg masses by counting all the egg masses that are in the tree using binoculars. So you look up into the tree and count all the egg masses on all the branches. And then you count them all on the ground in 1 meter by 1 meter subplots. So in the right-hand side of that diagram, you can see all the depiction of the 1 meter by 1 meter subplots inside the larger plot. And then what you do is you take all of those numbers together and extrapolate that out to find the number of egg masses per hectare. Once you have that number, that gets applied to a scale that the Ministry of Natural Resources comes up with based on how many egg masses cause what levels of defoliation. So you can see over on the left-hand side here, in the green is a certain number of egg masses. So from about 0 to 1200 is light defoliation. And that's as counted as everything sort of less than 40% defoliation. And that's something that's 40% is about the level that the average person can tell that a tree is starting to be defoliated. So anything less than 40% is really like not noticeable to the average person. Anything between 1200 to about 6000 is considered moderate. So about 40 to 75% of a forest stand, that's when you're starting to notice chewing, about half the leaves are gone. It becomes apparent that something's going on. And then over 6,000 egg masses per hectare is when you get that really severe defoliation. So that's when the leaves get entirely eaten, or your trees start to look like it's winter in July. So CBC also used this method to do surveys on our properties in 2021. Oops, sorry, excuse me. We also use this to do surveys on our properties in 2021. So we did 29 sites across the watershed and identified areas that have high presence of some of those key host species. So oak, maple, and poplar, which are the vulnerable communities to LDD and the primary source of the caterpillars. We also in 2021 did LDD monitoring for the town of Halton Hills and surrounding area. So we did Acton, Georgetown, and some of the smaller rural communities surrounding those towns. We did 45 points in natural areas, parks, and cemeteries, as well as 35 street tree surveys. So for the natural areas, we did the MKP plots, which you can see one of my staff setting up the plot here on the right-hand side. And then for the parks, cemeteries, and street trees, we did the modified 5-count method. And that is where we, like the Calidar plots, you count all the egg masses on a specific host tree that would be tree number 1. So if you look in the bottom right-hand diagram, this is our sort of pretend street. Tree number 1 would be sort of a specific host tree that we've picked. You count all the egg masses on that tree as well as the closest 5 trees. And then again, that number can be extrapolated out to get a community level assessment of what level of defoliation could be seen the following year. Okay. So forecast for 2022. So on a provincial level, looking at the Ministry of Natural Resources, what they're expecting to see, you can see that based on their egg mass surveys conducted in late fall in 6 districts across the southern region of Ontario, defoliation is forecasted to be moderate to severe in areas of Elmer, Guelph, Parry Sound, Bancroft, and Pembroke districts, and light in the areas of Midhurst. So like CBC, they noticed during the surveys that egg mass predation or attacks by birds and mammals was higher and at some egg mass sample sites, and also found evidence of parasitism and presence of some of those natural fungus and virus controls. Looking a little bit closer on a more regional scale, we also did sites across CBC watershed. And of the 29 sites we surveyed, we found that 7 of those sites were forecasting severe defoliation for 2022. So they had egg masses high enough levels that there could be severe defoliation this year. We found 8 of our sites were at moderate levels and 13 of them were at light levels. So what we found doing our surveys was that oak trees were heaviest hit, especially those that were found in warmer areas, higher elevations, and at forest edges or parks. So you can see the area along the escarpment, which if you can see my cursor here, is this column, this band running right kind of through the middle of the screen on the diagonal. So that is the escarpment, and this area is very oak and maple dominant, and it's at a higher elevation than the surrounding countryside. So this makes it sort of a prime hotspot for LDD. However, we did see noticeable mortality of caterpillars due to the virus and the fungus. We also noticed that egg masses were smaller and less abundant than in previous years. And we also found that egg masses were heavily impacted by parasitic insects and natural predators. A lot of the egg masses that we found had been sort of torn into or ripped apart by chickadees and other wildlife. So again, zooming in a little closer to the Halton Hills, Georgetown area results. So this is all the survey sites we did for town of Halton Hills. And as you can see, like with most LDD infestations, and again, like with what we've seen across CBC and also the MNR results, there are pockets where the infestation is high and the defoliation is predicted to be a little bit higher, and areas where there's a moderate or to light infestation. We've also seen that there was a clear edge effects and there was higher predicted defoliation for areas that were on slopes, especially south-facing slopes, where there was warmer temperatures in the spring and better hatch rates. So what is CBC doing to combat LDD moth? So CBC has increased our education and awareness efforts. This has included adding an LDD invasive species spotlight on our webpage that we keep updated with information and management techniques. We've also been releasing information to the public through online blogs and newsletters and social media posts. And we're hosting events and webinars and guest speaking on other webinars like the one tonight. With the CVC board approval of our updated invasive species strategy in December 2020, we've started development of an integrated pest management framework, which will expand our existing long-term monitoring plots to target priority areas within our conservation areas with respect to current and potential invasive species threats. So this includes monitoring for LDD moth, which started last fall and allows us to assess our properties for if and where a response might be necessary. This spring, we're determining if any localized ground management techniques will be employed to protect amenity trees in conservation areas. And we're also going to be supporting City of Mississauga's LDD management program as it relates to CVC-owned lands. So what can landowners do? So there's a few techniques that are really easy for landowners to do. They use simple supplies, and they are, while a bit time consuming, are very easy to do and can have good results when applied consistently. So egg mass scraping is one of those. That's the picture you can see on the left-hand side of the slide here. And that technique uses a paint scraping tool or a butter knife or any other kind of flat, blunt object to scrape the egg masses off the tree into a bucket. So you can use a paper bag or a peanut butter jar or an empty Tupperware. And those can be dumped into a bucket of warm soapy water. So if you use just water, the caterpillars can climb out. So you need to put the soap, dish soap is great. You can mix it up till it's foamy, use some warm water. And then we recommend that you give the bucket a couple of good stirs to, to break up the egg masses, and you can put a lid on the jar too, just to be safe if you would prefer, just to make sure all the caterpillars stay in there and get a good long soak in their bubble bath. The other thing that's really great to do is burlap wrapping. So burlap wrapping is really effective as the caterpillars start to get a little bit larger. So about late May through the month of June, you can check. Burlap banding is a great exercise. So to do that, you take a long piece of burlap and wrap it all the way around your tree. You want it to be touching or overlapping, so it goes all the way around 360. You want to tie a rope around the middle of that burlap and then fold the top half of the burlap down over the rope so that you've got a 2-layered burlap skirt on your tree at about chest level, or whatever's comfortable for you. About chest level is good. And then that's supported by the rope. And how this works is the caterpillars, because they feed mostly at night, they come down out of the canopy during the day and they hide in cool shaded places where predators and stuff can't get them. So they really like to hide under the burlap, and they'll congregate under there during the hottest part of the day. So what you can do is every day we recommend that you go out, or most days that you can go out, and you can lift up the burlap and just scrape or pick those caterpillars right off the tree and out of the burlap into your bucket of soapy water and dispose of those caterpillars. So there used to be a method that was recommended a lot, similar to the burlap banding, which was sticky tape or tanglefoot. So sort of like a sticky band method. However, we're starting to hear more and more stories about negative impacts to other wildlife, so including little small songbirds and rodents and snakes, as well as other beneficial insects getting stuck on these sticky bands. And so we're not recommending that anymore. The burlap is different because it's not, it's targeting LDD specifically because they're choosing to go under the burlap. They're not getting like stuck under there. It's less likely to impact sort of non-target species. So it's a little bit safer and a little bit more friendly to other wildlife. We also recognize that these methods are time consuming and they're not really feasible for really large properties. However, keep in mind that a single egg mass can have up to 1,000 caterpillars in it. So every little bit does help. Even if it seems like your bucket of egg masses isn't that helpful in the grand scheme of things, it really can make a difference for a single tree to have a few thousand less caterpillars on it. Also, I forgot to mention, for the egg mass scraping, instead of using the scraper and the bucket of water, we have had some people had success using shop vacs or other sort of handheld vacuum cleaners, dust busters, to actually suck the egg masses right off the tree using their shop vac. You can rig extension hoses or other things onto your shop vac and and vacuum away. It's a bit of a quicker method. Some people find using the bag inside the shop vac or putting some other kind of terry cloth filter helps collect the egg masses, and they can be dumped directly into the soapy water. So other techniques that are available are chemical techniques. So those are things that landowners can apply on their own, but can be done in order to help combat LDD. So there is triazine injections, which is using a product called triazine, which was created by Bioforest. It's a naturally occurring sort of anti-insect formulation that's injected into the trunk of the trees to provide protection to the whole canopy. It was used predominantly in emerald ash borer, against the emerald ash borer to help protect trees. It is effective at protecting the canopy, but it does create holes in the trees where the injections are placed. So it can sometimes cause a little bit of damage, even as you're trying to help. Other efforts that can be undertaken is ground spraying or aerial spraying of BTK. So BTK stands for Bacillus thuringiensis curtis-stachy, and that is a naturally occurring bacteria that's found in soil that infects the caterpillars when it's ingested by the caterpillars. So it's sprayed on the foliage, and when they eat enough and the caterpillars are small enough, it can kill them. Now, it's effective on the early caterpillar stages, so usually it's applied when the caterpillars are sort of in their first to third instar. So that's about mid to late May, and is applied twice throughout the season in order to get sort of the first wave of caterpillars in mid-May, and then about 2 weeks later, a week to 2 weeks later, is applied again to get sort of the next caterpillars. The only downside, well, one of the main downsides to BTK is that not only does it affect LDD caterpillars, but it also affects any caterpillar that's in an early instar stage that is eating leaves or crawling on the sprayed trees at that time. If any caterpillar eats a leaf that's been sprayed with BTK, it will die. So while BTK is great for combating LDD populations, it can also have large negative effects on other caterpillar populations, and can have cascading effects as well on things like breeding birds or other organisms that depend on caterpillars as a food source. So while BTK is a very effective method and helicopter sprays are great for covering large areas, they do have to be taken with a grain of salt and made sure that that's sort of the last resort method that can be used, because they can have cascading impacts on a lot of wildlife. Another option that can be used, it's relatively new, is a product called Bover, which is a liquidized form of the virus, that NPV virus that we were discussing earlier. So this hasn't yet been approved for widespread use in Canada, but it has been, or is planning to be piloted by a couple of groups, including the City of Toronto is hoping to pilot it this year. And so instead of using the BTK, they're using a liquidized version of the virus to spread it. And this is meant to be a lot more specific than the BTK, so it's not killing other caterpillars like the other spray does. This virus is only targeted to the caterpillars, and because it only affects the caterpillars, it's about 100% lethal when it's exposed to large caterpillar populations. Excuse me for 1 second. So just to wrap up a couple summary points for LDD before we move on and talk about a couple of emerging threats. So LDD, although it can have large and really negative impacts on a lot of our street trees and park trees, on the whole, we consider it more of a nuisance pest. So in natural areas and in larger forests, it does defoliate trees, it's true, but trees in natural areas, healthy, strong trees, can usually withstand about 3 years of repeated moderate to severe defoliation before they start to experience negative health effects. Unless there's a lot of other stressors present, the trees are pretty resilient and can do a good job of bouncing back. You'll see that they'll start to refresh their leaves. After the caterpillars pupate, they'll re-leaf out and do okay. They don't grow as fast during outbreak years, but they usually survive pretty well. On the other hand, trees that are in the city tend to do a little bit worse. They are exposed to a lot of other stressors like drought and salt and compaction that trees in natural areas don't have. So if you do have a tree in your yard some things you can do to help it along and combat LDD even during non-LDD outbreak years are things like watering your tree, making sure you're pruning it appropriately and at the right times, and making sure that it's not getting too much compaction or salt or other things that can deteriorate its health. So keeping your trees healthy and well watered is key. And then during outbreak years, doing some of those home activities like egg mass scraping or banding can help keep your trees healthy and green. So CBC will continue to monitor and observe changes in the status of the outbreak. And then I guess the million-dollar question is, will the outbreak collapse soon? And the answer is we've documented occurrences of natural controls being rampant throughout the watershed. So typically, surveys are much more accurate at predicting defoliation towards the beginning of an outbreak. That's when the natural controls are low, and fluctuations in the population are determined kind of solely based on number of egg masses that are present, and that kind of leads to how many will be there during the next generation. It's much harder to predict later in an outbreak when the natural controls are ramping up, because even though the egg masses are present, there can be large impacts from predators and parasitoids that aren't seen just based on the number of egg masses that can really knock a population down. However, CBC and other conservation areas in the GTA, so Toronto Region Conservation and Conservation Halton and Hamilton, we're all seeing similar things in terms of the pests and the parasitoids and the natural predators. And we're optimistic that LDD levels should start to decline. All right, so next I'd like to move on to Hemlock woolly adelgid. So Hemlock woolly adelgid, for those of you who haven't heard of it before, is an introduced invasive insect that came to North America on infected nursery stock. It was introduced from Japan in the early 1900s. It spread from Virginia throughout a lot of the eastern seaboard in the United States, and it affects eastern hemlock. It's a small aphid-like insect that feeds on the tree's nutrients at the base of its needles. So it has a little needle-like stylet that it pushes in the base of the needles and sucks out all the water and the sugar from the needles and basically sucks the tree dry until it gets dry and brittle and it doesn't survive. The aphid-like insects also surround themselves with these white, woolly, waxy sacs, and that's visible in the bottom photo on the right-hand side there that you can see. It looks like little cotton balls on the base of the branches. Okay, so the life cycle of the Hemlock woolly adelgid is a bit complicated, so we're not going to go into it too much, but it does create multiple generations per year. All individuals within a population are female and reproduce asexually. And the stage that we're most concerned about is this crawler stage that's been outlined in red. And this is where they do the majority of their feeding. So right now we're in the egg stage, where we're seeing those sort of fluffy egg masses that are at the base of the needle, so those little cotton balls. And then we'll be moving into the summer and fall stage where these will start feeding on the trees. So why is Hemlock woolly adelgid a problem? So hemlock is an ecologically significant species. So although it makes up a fairly small portion of the forest, about 4% of forests within the CBC watershed are hemlock dominated, but they fill a unique niche and create dense shade because they keep all of their lower branches, and their branches make a very thick, dense cover. This means that they can moderate temperature. So they're often found near streams and in ravines and in places where they cool water and cool ecosystems, especially sort of water dominated ones. So many animals, insects, birds, and fish and other aquatic organisms depend on hemlocks for some of all of their life cycle. They also stabilize the soil on steep banks and ravines and helps anchor those hillsides in place. So they're considered a keystone species throughout the CBC watershed, even though there aren't that many of them, because their importance within an ecosystem is far greater than their relative abundance. And as anyone who's walked through a hemlock stand will know, it's dark in there and it's noticeably cooler than the surrounding environment. So you can imagine the impacts that it has on sort of the shade and the coolness of water and other habitats, microhabitats around them. So unfortunately, that lack of natural predators for HWA and lack of tree resistance means that HWA moving through a community can cause widespread mortality in as little as 4 years. It also makes the trees unstable and susceptible to blowdown and cracking. So you can see on the right-hand side here, the tree has just become brittle at the base and snapped off in a windstorm. And on the left-hand side, the trees get this sort of brownish grayish cast as the sort of sugars and nutrients are sucked out of their needles and the needles start to die off. So the tree sort of gets this sort of unhealthy grayish bronze cast. HWA spreads easily via birds, humans, and the wind. And because they do asexual reproduction, which means you only need one individual in order to reproduce the following year, one individual can start a whole new population. So it's really easy to spread from place to place. So where is this terrifying thing? This is a map showing the distribution of HWA in the United States in 2018. So as you can see, it originally started in Virginia, but it has moved across most of the eastern seaboard. And that was about 4 years ago this map was from. And you can see it's getting very close to Ontario there. And as recently as 2010, one infected hemlock was found in Etobicoke. You can see the little pushpin there beside the outline of the CBC watershed. And then other infected trees were found in 2012, 2013, and 2019 in the Niagara Gorge. And that's that little belt of 3 pushpins in a row here. In 2009, a larger infestation was found in Wainfleet. And then in 2021, it was found again in Fort Erie. So it has been creeping towards the Credit Valley watershed up through the states, and now it's within about 100 kilometers of our watershed. And the infestation in Wainfleet is still ongoing. It hasn't been fully controlled. The Canadian Forest Agency and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency are trying to look at alternative methods for control, because right now we don't have a lot of options for control in Canada. All right, so moving on to the next stage. So what is CBC doing about this? So we have been identifying dense hemlock stands through our ecological land classification data, as well as our forest resource inventory data. So our team specifically, the invasive species management team, has been working with a lot of the other monitoring and surveying people at CBC to find those populations of dense hemlock and identify where they are. We do detection monitoring each April. So we started in 2017 and have been doing it every year in April. So we've been out in the last week, and I'm actually going out tomorrow to finish up our HWA monitoring in the Silver Creek area. So kind of over near you. So during this process, we take Velcro covered racquet balls, which you can see in the bottom left-hand slide here, and we shoot them up into the tree canopy with slingshots. And the idea is you want this racquetball to go up one side of the tree and come down the other side of the tree, brushing up against the branches as it goes. The idea is those little fluffy cotton balls will get stuck on the Velcro, and then you can pick the ball up once it hits the ground and check the Velcro to see if there are any fluffy cotton balls on there. If there are, then we report it to the CFIA and we'd have a big problem. Luckily, we haven't run into that situation yet. Everything has been good. Yeah, so we're continuing that to make sure that our populations are being monitored for any presence of HWA. And the reason we're being so diligent and vigilant about this is because the control options are limited. So the US has several different chemicals that can be used, but nothing has been registered in Canada yet. So right now, the only solution to this or temporary measure for removal is to cut the trees down and destroy them. And so obviously this is something that can be done on a really small scale, but if an infestation was to get out of hand, it's really difficult to contain, to cut all trees, all hemlock trees down in a really wide radius. So it's something we want to make sure that we're on the lookout for and that we don't let this get sort of past the point of addressing. So what can you do as landowners? You can keep your eyes peeled for fluffy egg sacs on hemlock trees and report any sightings to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CBC's invasive species team, or EDMAPS Ontario. And I know we're getting a little close on time. But if I could quickly take us through the Asian longhorn beetle here. So the Asian longhorn beetle is an invasive beetle native to China and Korea. It was first detected in the US and Canada in 1990. And to date, there have been 15 US states and 2 provinces that have had Asian longhorn beetle interception and eradications. So it's a shiny black beetle that can be about 3 to 4 centimeters long, which is quite large, and it has up to 20 spots on its back and long striped antenna. So I brought a little picture here of a real Asian longhorn beetle. And this is its native look-alike here, the white-spotted Sawyer beetle. And you can see the Asian longhorn beetle is quite a bit larger and has those white spots and really long antenna. So its life cycle is a common sort of beetle style life cycle. So the adults are active from early summer to early fall. They feed on bark and twigs throughout the mating season, and they chew little pits inside of the bark in preparation for mating, and they lay eggs singly in these little pits. Throughout the course of the mating season, they'll lay about 25 to 50 eggs each. The young larvae hatch out of the eggs and begin burrowing into the tree to feed on the sapwood just underneath the bark of the tree. As the larvae grow, they make bigger and bigger holes within the wood of the tree, until as they pupate, they emerge as adults and create these big holes in the bark of the tree as they come out that are about 1.5 to 2 centimeters. So about big enough that you could sort of stick your pinky finger right into the hole, which is pretty large and noticeable. So what impacts does this have on the tree? So the feeding of the larvae girdles the tree. So as the larvae make these galleries under the bark, as they grow and eat the sapwood, this cuts off the supply of sugar and water from the bottom of the tree to the top of the tree and basically strangles the tree. The exit holes, as you can see in the top right-hand picture here, are quite large, and they weaken the structural integrity of the tree and can cause rot in the inside of the tree. The preferred hosts of Asian longhorn beetle are hardwood trees, including maple, birch, poplar, willow, and elm. And 42% of the woodlands within the CBC watershed are dominated by maple. So those are woodlots where maple is the key and primary species. There's a lot more where maple is sort of an understory or a secondary species, and it's not a dominated canopy species. So having an invasive species that could wipe out maples entirely would be devastating for the watershed. It would also have huge impacts for the maple syrup and forestry industries. So, excuse me. In Ontario, there was a population discovered in Toronto in 2003. And so all the host trees within a 400-meter radius were removed, because the only known control measure for Asian longhorn beetle anywhere is the removal of every single host tree within a 400-meter radius of the infested trees, because this is the distance that 99% of the population is expected to fly. So this is sort of the total radius that the population could expand. In 2013, there was a second outbreak in Mississauga, and so an even larger radius of 800 meters of host trees was removed to ensure that the beetle would be totally eradicated. So these are pretty drastic measures, considering that these were often involving private property. So if you can imagine the CFIA coming to your door and saying they need to cut all your backyard trees, it's very drastic and was alarming for a lot of people. But it was effective. In 2020, after 5 or 6 years of monitoring, they deemed that the beetle had become totally eradicated from Toronto, and that Ontario was Asian longhorn beetle free. So in total, they cut over 30,000 trees and spent $35 million to manage it. And that was a very small 800-meter wide population. Okay, so what to look for? So these are some things to keep an eye out if you're out and about walking around. So Asian longhorn beetle adults are very distinctive. You can see their shiny black bodies, their white spots, and their big sort of striped antenna. You can also look for the shallow pits or depressions chewed in the bark and the large round exit holes that you can see on the left-hand side here. And then as the larvae go through their feeding stages and start to tunnel through the wood, you can see the sort of sawdust and frass, which is the caterpillar poop mixture that will gather in the sort of branch crevices, the trunk, or the base of the tree. So those are, excuse me, all good things to look for. And I wanted to bring up this one example. So this tree was actually found in the Hungry Hollow Ravine. For those of you that live in the area, this was off the Miller Street entrance at the top of the hill. And one day I was doing some invasive species monitoring work in Hungry Hollow and walked by this tree and had a little bit of a panic attack. Seeing that there were signs of Asian longhorn beetle, I can see the shotgun holes there. I can see the lemon-shaped pits where the females would have laid their eggs. I called my supervisor and said, I found it in Hungry Hollow. We need to call the CFIA. This is a big problem. And it turns out the CFIA had created this tree as a demonstration tree on purpose. They had used a drill to like make these markings and make it look like it was attacked by Asian longhorn beetle. And I guess they had at one point had a sign by the tree saying that it was a demonstration tool, but the sign had been misappropriated somewhere else. And then for me, walked along thinking that we had an infestation. So the upside of that is that it is really easy to spot the signs and symptoms when you know what to look for. So keep your eyes peeled. And if you do spot something, albeit not the one at Hungry Hollow at the top of the hill, please let us know. So you can report any sightings to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CBC's Invasive Species Team, as well as EdMaps Ontario. And with that, I am sorry that I took so long, but I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Bryana. So as she just said, if there's anyone who has any questions, you can pop them into the chat now. We have a couple minutes that we can answer a couple. I was just curious, as we kind of went through the different invasive species, just if you had a comment on why some of them maybe have expanded faster than others. Obviously with the LDD moth, it was almost 100 years kind of before it reached Ontario. And then even there, it still took like another 50 or so years. Is that all part of just the life cycle, or is there something just about each insect that's different for why it's moving at different speeds?
Yeah, so the LDD moth is an interesting example because even though it's an invasive species, it's technically considered naturalized because it has native parasitoids and predators and funguses and diseases that are endemic to Canada that will lower the population and actually impact its population. It's considered naturalized. So it has natural controls that can affect it. And that helps balance its population dynamics. So instead of coming here, most invasive species, when they come here, they have no natural enemies. So they have nothing that eats them. There's no funguses or diseases that affect them because they're not from here. So they didn't have these things that originated with them to control the population. And so they sort of come here and then just grow out of control exponentially. Whereas the LDD, because it has those natural controls that will eat it, it kind of keeps the population in check a little bit.
Great. And I see you've got some questions coming here. So what do Europeans do about LDD moths for Asian longhorn beetles? Do we have any knowledge of that?
Yeah, I think what they may be getting at there is the people who live in the countries where those species originate from. And the answer is that for the Asian longhorn beetle, for example, they do have natural enemies in Asia where it's from. So in Korea and China and some of those places, there are fungus and there are some flies and parasitic insects, wasps, that actually predate the population and so keeps them under control, just like a lot of our natural insects, feed off of each other here. We just it's more of a harmonious balance. The problem is when a species goes into a place where they didn't originate from, and then those natural controls, those checks and balances aren't in place, and that's when the populations can kind of get out of control.
And someone wondering if walnut trees are attractive to the LDD moth.
I haven't heard of that in particular, but it's possible that you've got a really delicious walnut tree. Usually walnuts are pretty anti-feedant. They have very strong chemical in them called a juglone that gives them that sort of distinctive sharp smell if you were to rub a leaf or a walnut. But it's possible that they've been eating, especially during outbreak years. They tend to go after almost anything. So you may have noticed some feeding for sure.
Now, for getting higher into the tree, somebody's wondering, can you use a high pressure washer with soap to get up into those upper areas?
So pressure washers are tricky. If you are doing egg mass removal, I would recommend against it, because although you can sort of effectively blast them off the trees, the eggs are quite hardy and they can hatch on the ground from wherever they land. So water alone won't kill the eggs. They have a pretty thick coating, and the reason you have to stir them into soapy water is because the soap actually helps to break down that coating on the edge of the egg and lets the water and the soap penetrate into the egg and kill the little larvae inside. So the water alone won't kill them, and blasting them off the tree, which means they'll hatch on the ground. Now, if you wanted to blast the caterpillars out of the tree, that might be an effective treatment option in terms of like getting them out of there. But you do just have to be careful that you're not actually blasting the leaves off the tree as well, because that's the point where they're starting to unfurl and they're pretty fragile. So just maybe be cautious. You don't want to be doing more harm than good by removing all the leaves, trying to get rid of the caterpillars.
Somebody did note in the comments here that their walnut tree was affected last year. So obviously, I know last year was a particularly bad year. There must be some other trees being impacted. Oh, and kind of just what you're talking about here about the water. So if these caterpillars fall into a lake, do the fish eat them? And does that impact the population?
I mean, it's possible that fish might eat them. I'm not entirely sure if it's sort of a favorite food of any particular fish, or if that's something that's, part of their regular diet. I feel like they might be eaten by the odd fish if they were to fall in the lake. I don't think that's really going to have huge impacts on their population. Just in terms of, a whole population isn't going to fall into the lake necessarily, but it could certainly help.
I think this question maybe is getting us away from insects, but do you have any suggestions on how to control fungus spread on blue spruce trees? There are a few different funguses and diseases that can affect conifer trees, spruce being one of them. I would hesitate to offer any advice, just not knowing what it might be for sure. But if you do have questions about that, maybe contact a local tree company or an arborist company and see if they have any suggestions for you based on sort of a closer up look at what the fungus is, and maybe give you some recommendations. All right, so if anyone has any questions, you can pop them to the chat now. And I guess just kind of on that note, are there any other resources you would like to direct us to if anyone has any more questions about any different insects in the area?
Yeah, if you have any questions about LDD, we do have a LDD website. I can grab the link here if you'd like and pop it into the chat. Let me bring it up here. But like I mentioned, CVC has the LDD sort of invasive species spotlight, and we do update that regularly with information. We have resources for landowners. We have an FAQ on there. And then we also have a lot of information about other invasive species. So if you're interested in other insects or plants that might be invasive in your backyard, we have lots of information about that as well. So I can throw the website in the chat to everybody. And then CVC's general website is just cvc.ca if anybody is interested in just taking a look around just for general information. Other places that you can look is the Invasive Species Center also has a lot of information about invasive species. So they have information about all three of the insects I talked about tonight. They have information on HWA, they have information on Asian Longhorn beetle, there's fact sheets and more information about their life cycle and biology if you're interested in following up on that at all or looking for more of those ID features. They also have information about plants and other aquatic invasive species as well, if you're interested in pursuing more information about invasive species in general.
Hey, at this time, I don't see any other questions. So on behalf of everyone that's here tonight, thank you very much, Bryana, for joining us and for sharing all of that information about both the LDD moth and the other invasive insects in the area.
No problem. Thank you for having me out tonight. It was great to meet you and to talk to everybody. So I hope you enjoy your walks and keep your eyes peeled, and let me know if you spot anything out there.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Bryana. And I just want to let everyone on the call know, if you did attend one of our 2 lectures with Credit Valley Conservation Live, we do have a draw for $20 off a tree or shrub purchased at Sheridan Nurseries in Georgetown. And that is coordinated through the town of Halton Hills. So we'll be sending some information about that out in the post-event survey email. So keep your eyes peeled if you have any interest in that draw. And finally, if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, I do invite you to join us on Tuesday, May 10th at 7:30 p.m. We're having an evening with J.B. McKinnon. So he is discussing his latest book, The Day the World Stopped Shopping, which is our One Book, One Halton Hills title for 2022. And so everyone is welcome to attend, whether or not you read the book and whether or not you have a library card. Just go ahead and sign up through the website. And he's going to be talking about what he calls the consumer dilemma, and that is the need to balance a healthy economy with the health both of ourselves and of the planet. And so J.B. McKinnon is an award-winning journalist and author who is probably most notable for co-authoring the 100-Mile Diet. And we are honored to have him joining us live from the West Coast again on May 10th. So you can register through the library's website for that event. Otherwise, thank you very much to Bryana, to the audience, and to our partners, Credit Valley Conservation and the town of Halton Hills. We are thrilled that you were able to join us tonight.